Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the organisers for organising. So today I'm going to talk about some preliminary findings from a project that I started working on a few months ago, I've called it multiple things actually in those few months. I keep changing the name. At the moment, it's called Living Queer with Data. But it might be called something slightly different on the programme. So the project aims to explore how issues of trust and privacy, we've been talking about today, are negotiated in the lives of LGBTQ people at the moment who are living in Brighton and Hove in the UK, and how there might be very specific issues for this group of people. So I've been conducting a small pilot project at the moment with people recruited from various social media channels, and I've interviewed them using Microsoft Teams. And the project was advertised to LGBTQ people living in Brighton and Hove, but at the moment, only white, gay, cis men have come forward. Interesting in itself. We won't talk about that today, unless you want to know more about that in the questions. But I had to pause recruitment on this project for a bunch of other stuff that kind of got in the way. So at the moment, I have these 5 interviews, and I actually thought it might be quite useful to reflect upon some of the similarities that came out of these interviews, especially when I'm thinking about people's relationship with data based on various types of practices and identities. So I conducted 5 interviews with participatory mapping with these participants, and 3 of them conducted research diaries over 1 month, which were recorded via the secure messaging service Signal. I was kind of calling them data diaries. Not sure if that's the right term yet, but there we go. And they recorded moments in which they thought about data. When did they think about it? What caused them to think about it? Was it about trust? Was it about privacy? Or was it about something else? And I'm going to start the next phase of the project in September. So I have seed funding from a scheme at the University of Brighton to conduct 20 interviews with LGBTQ people in Brighton using the participatory mapping, and also a set of arts-based workshops, which will take place next summer. But what I want to highlight in this paper is the ambivalence towards data, and how these participants kind of made sense of living with the unknown and the uncertainty through which we kind of come to know data. And to do so, I'm thinking with the research around digital data at kind of an everyday scale and how it shows up in our everyday lives. So I'm going to be thinking about some of the work that digital geographers have been doing that explores these new forms of surveillance and tracking, and the ways capitalism shows up in these things as they emerge and become increasingly, and as our societies become increasingly reliant on data and algorithms. And in the project, I want to see what happens in people's everyday lives, how they're learning to live with the constant changing landscapes of data and algorithms. And so I'm following some of the work by Sarah Pink and Deborah Lupton, who've been exploring the relationship between everyday lives, bodies, and digital data, and what they call mundane data, which they say has enabled us to center the analysis on the sites of everyday life, where digital data is lively and linky. And that is where data becomes part of and open to those constantly changing configurations of things and processes through which life continues and through which effective meanings are emergent. And so I'm interested in how some of these anxieties might emerge around data and become increasingly important at kind of local, national, and international scales. And when thinking about issues of trust and privacy, I'm interested in kind of how trust isn't this singular thing. It's temporal, it's spatial, it's unpredictable. Not really. Then trust and privacy aren't really binary things. But I'm also interested in how this is felt in and through the body, and how people make decisions around trust and privacy, and the moments that might make sense or might not make sense. And obviously how this might vary across different people at different times with different identity positions. So to do that today, I'm going to talk around 2 aspects, two different parts of my preliminary forms of analysis. And one is the ways that these men talk about learning to live with data. And then I'll talk around some of their anxieties around data. So first of all, learning to live with data. So this is an interview with Jake. So the picture at the side is an aspect of his kind of map that he drew, and then the interview quote is him talking about the map. So he says, every person is full of data. They're all like, everything that you do basically ends up somewhere, even if you go to the gym. If you're a gym member, use the app, and the moment you use the app, wherever you do, they know. And also the data, you have no idea where it ends up. You just think that it's for your own use, but these huge corporations are behind it and they really want to sell it. So that's why the data starts to change into pounds, basically, in this picture. If you can see that, it starts off as kind of numbers, and then the next body is numbers and pounds, and the final body is pounds. So among the participants, there was an awareness of these processes. There was an awareness of data being collected. There was an awareness that it was a commodity. There was an awareness that it goes somewhere to someone and does something. But again, these are the things that were kind of a bit unknown. They couldn't, a bit untangible. They didn't really know exactly where these things go and where they end up. But they knew that they went somewhere and it was a commodity. And for some people, that was something kind of quite easy to kind of become comfortable with. And so, and this awareness often meant that some people they talked about not really caring about it. And so this is following on in my interview with Jake, and he talked about. So, like, for me personally, I don't mind, because the data that I've put on dating apps and the data that I have on Instagram and all of that, people know that I'm gay, people know how tall I am, people know I have bluish eyes, I'm blonde, and all these things, that I work out, all these things. So but I get for other people, and I'm not very sensitive about data, but I get that if you're not sure how they use your data or what the world is doing with your data and all of this, I get that's a huge no, basically. But I'm a bit conflicted. For me, I don't care. But for other people, I definitely get that people really do not want to share all of this. And also, all of these people that are on these dating apps as discreet and not showing their face, the problem is if this information comes into the wrong hands. So in that last moment there, he's specifically referring to Grindr and people on there being discreet, and discreet meaning, they're not showing their face. They don't want to be known to be using a kind of queer dating app. So this kind of position was kind of really articulated amongst a lot of the participants. It doesn't matter for me, but they understand that it might matter for those who might be more vulnerable. So he uses the example of people who are discreet using dating apps, who don't want to be known. And then we also, later in the interview, Jake and I talk about the ways he mentions that some trans people might be more skeptical with data, given the current moment of hostility in the UK. And so, in another interview, we talked a bit more about, with an interview with Andrew here, we talked about more why he felt he wasn't under threat or vulnerable to the collection of data in his life. And he says, if you're not doing anything wrong, you've got nothing to worry about. And I think I'm a fairly upstanding member of the community. So in terms of myself, I'm not doing illicit activities that are going to get picked up in some form of data and shared to the local policeman. So I guess that's probably where I come from the most, a clean life, I suppose. And I do feel that the more data that's collected about everything in the world, I'd say the better on the whole, because, patterns will get discovered. Disease progression, I guess the pandemic is a good example of that. There is so much data generated about that. You can see the pandemic moving across the world. I'm quite happy for my data to be contributed to a bigger picture of what's going on. So there is this that I don't have time to unpack about, what it means to be a good citizen, about whiteness, about respectable living. And And it's important to know that all of these kind of, are coming through in this. And that, certain aspects of everyday life and practices are quite key in how people are understanding some of their relationships with data, but also how data might be positioned, as either good or bad, or even both, and kind of good or bad. Oh, I did not mean to do that. So whilst people are learning ways to live with the unknown of data, this doesn't mean that they're not, there aren't any anxieties around this, which is the next part of the presentation, around these data anxieties. So I've talked about how, these men were learning to become comfortable with this, how they kind of justify how data shows up in their lives. But that doesn't mean that it was kind of all great. So Andrew, the first participant the previous participant I was just talking about, the guy the clean life, he actually goes on to say, I guess on the flip side, like on Grindr, in the past, where I've shared not necessarily the most parent-friendly photos with someone, so he's kind of talking about nudes, sexually explicit photos, I guess in the future, if I want to become Prime Minister, there's things like that where messages and photos might come out, but I do feel that that's unlikely. So while there was this aspect of respectable living for Andrew, when it came to some of the sexual practices he does on his phone, in the case of using dating apps, there was an anxiety about what this might mean, if any of these things were kind of leaked, or any of these other aspects, any of these parts of data came out into his everyday life. And we talked a little bit about, in the interview, about Grindr over the past few years coming into quite a lot of kind of scrutiny for their data sharing practices, especially around things to do with HIV status and the selling of that data. And this wasn't the only form of kind of anxiety or kind of niggle that was related to these sexual practices. So another interview with Stan, another one of my participants, he says, over the lockdown, I had some moments with geolocation, and that was about the NHS track and trace. So that's the National Health Service app that is used in the UK for kind of contact tracing. With the heightened sense of awareness about where you were, I was aware if I had my phone with me or not, and that it was seeing where I was or wasn't. Or if I went to the bushes and was cruising, which felt like was one of the only sexual options that felt available and safe at particular moments of stark need during the pandemic. Then I'd be like, there's only one reason someone would be at this location and wouldn't be at home. So he talks a little bit more about this. So there was an ambivalence about doing it in the first place. And then it's easier to brush aside ambivalence if there's no possibility that anyone knows or sees. You won't have to talk about it. You can pretend it's not happening. And it's almost like a little fake conscience operating in some way. And so what I think is interesting here is about this idea of this conscience, that digital data feel like the way it might present itself might bring awareness to things that maybe people think they shouldn't be doing. And there's a lot of potential impacts around this. And I'm going to kind of quickly skip past this next example because I've got 2 minutes, but the final thing was around how these things might show up in the home. And Jake talks about here, the home feeling like this is supposed to be this kind of safe, private space where you can be intimate and do things. And actually, the increasing use of technologies to facilitate the home reshapes that. And, they're becoming aware of when their sonus lights up and talks, when they're just having a conversation. And we talked about intimate conversation or jokes between him and his partner that, they're not really quite sure why it's listening to that, or if they want these things to be listening to this. And the last part there, so there's this constant something in the room. Even if you're alone on the couch and the sonus starts talking, it's like, really, bitch, really? And so, some final thoughts on this. So I think there are some interesting ways that people are learning to live with data in their lives. There are certainly some uncertainties around it. What it might do to people's lives, but also how people might become comfortable with it or reoriented around it. Data reoriented around data and finding ways to make living with data comfortable despite knowing some of these issues. But these feelings also emerge with identities and practices, things that we might perceive to be good or bad, moral or immoral. I'm using air quotes there. And data might bring to the fore these moments when people feel like something is immoral, whether that be frequenting particular spaces where they feel like they shouldn't be. And this, felt form of surveillance might be limiting for some bodies and people doing particular things. And this varies across spaces and places, where people are located, whether that's appropriate, but also kind of happening slowly in particular moments. The previous quote from Jake talks about how the introduction of these technologies are kind of slow, and all of a sudden they kind of have a home which is filled and they're not really sure how they now feel about that. And so I kind of wanted to finish around kind of this quote with Sarah Pink, where we kind of, we're in a world where people do not usually feel sure that their data is secure, could be lost or stolen or compromised, and that living with data means living in a world of uncertainty, where vulnerability is taken for granted, and the best that can be done is to devise a way of living with data that pushes aside the anxieties and feels all right. And I think what I would like to kind of do further with these ideas is actually think about how does it feel to feel all right for different people at different times across different spaces who are living different lives. Thank you very much.